G'day, I'm Chris Muir. I'm an ADF Product Manager for the Application Development Tools part of Oracle Corporation. Now, I remember in the good old days, which is probably only 10 years ago, that my dad, who worked a full career, used to very meticulously keep an address book of all his contacts that he used to work with. Not just his friends and families, but every business contact that he had. He'd keep their names, their phone numbers, their addresses, and each year he'd go through and rewrite that address book just to make sure he had all the up-to-date details. Now today, with the advent of these devices, and I guess the internet with services like Gmail and Hotmail and all the social media services, we have lots of different contacts and address books that we actually use on a day-by-day basis. Now this does present a big challenge. Just the other day I had access to our HR system and I was looking up somebody's details in another address book from our employee database and went, oh, I want to contact that person but they're not in my address book on the device. And it was like, how am I going to contact them? I can see their details there. I don't really want to go and type their numbers in. What can I do? So this brings in the concept on smartphones and tablets and similar devices of giving our applications facilities to work with the on-device contacts or address book and vice versa, taking those contacts and putting them into our corporate systems and so on. We really need a level of integration there. So in this ADF Mobile presentation today, we will be looking at how to effectively integrate the contact system, or what I like to call the address book, into your application so you can do things like finding contacts, saving contacts, updating contacts, all the type of things that you need to do just to keep all your address books in sync. As such, what we'll cover in this in-depth presentation is the three different ways you integrate ADF mobile applications with the local address book, that being through the data control palette, the Java APIs, or the JavaScript APIs. In addition, we'll discuss some minor limitations that you'll separately hit on the Android and iPhone platforms in making use of these services. Before we undertake this deep dive into the contact services, I need to highlight the fact that this presentation was published when ADF Mobile version 1 was the current release, specifically for JDeveloper 11.1.2.3.0. By the time you view this presentation, there may be later releases of ADF Mobile available that might have resulted in changes to some of the content that I'm going to discuss today, in particular the APIs. Please take time to consult the latest ADF Mobile documentation via this bit.ly link to ensure that you have the latest information at hand. So returning to the content at hand, first let's cover off the overall architecture picture of how ADF Mobile integrates with the device surfaces such as email, SMS, the camera, GPS and contacts on your device. This picture shows the common architecture diagram from ADF Mobile, and specifically in red the overall JVM container that ADF Mobile runs in on your iOS or Android device. In order for the ADF Mobile application to connect and communicate with the device services, ADF Mobile makes use of PhoneGap, highlighted here in blue, which provides these services. PhoneGap, also known as Apache Cordova, provides the APIs under the covers that ADF Mobile makes use of to access your phone or tablet's email, SMS, camera, GPS and contact services. It's worthwhile noting, though, that ADF Mobile abstracts away from the underlying PhoneGap solution and wraps ADF APIs around these PhoneGap services. But essentially, underneath it is indeed PhoneGap that is used. As such, not only is Oracle documentation a valid place to look up information on how to use these services, but so is the PhoneGap or Cordova documentation. In particular, this external documentation includes useful information on the capabilities and limitations of the different services on different devices which you're likely to deploy to. When considering contacts or working with the contacts on your device, the PhoneGap ADF Mobile solution lets you to work with essentially four core functions, that is creating, updating and removing a single contact, and also searching, or more commonly known as finding contacts. Overall, ADF Mobile through PhoneGap provides a wide range of services you can make use of on your phone or tablet, such as the contact services that we're going to discuss today. In addition, ADF Mobile provides multiple different mechanisms for developers to make use of these facilities, some of which are available for all services and some are limited to particular mechanisms only. Of these mechanisms, there is essentially four. The first is the data control palette, which is one of the main productivity boosters of the JDeveloper IDE. Through a device data control and associated methods, this allows developers to literally drag and drop the associated device services, such as adding or finding contacts, onto an ADF Mobile AMX page. And JDeveloper will wire up the page and components such there is little programming required on the developer's part. The second mechanism is EL, or expression language. Through EL, an explicit device scope object is available to allow developers to query the device services. For example, for the contact services, as you can see at the bottom here, we have hash ellipses device.device.hasContacts, which returns a true or false to say, does this device actually have an address book or a contacts list that you can work with? And you could use this to enable and disable the facilities for the user to access. Alternatively to these mechanisms, if the developer wants more control over the service integration, via a Java managed bean in their AMX pages, there is also a Java API that provides programmatic access to these services. As you can see in this very brief example at the bottom of the page, in 3 lines, on line 1 we get access to the device manager. On line 2 we're then going to attempt to find a number of contacts, searching the name field for the name Smith, and the true here indicates that we will return multiple entries if found. Finally, line number 3, if we do find any of those entries, on line 3, device.removeContact, contact 0, we're going to remove the first contact from the address book on this particular device. Finally, if you decide to create local HTML pages in your ADF mobile application over AMX pages, there is also a JavaScript API available to you for working with the contacts, and we'll talk about that in this presentation. With all that in mind, let's demonstrate how to build an ADF mobile application that integrates with the contact services on your device through the data control palette by using the data control palette to wire up an AMX page with all the necessary controls. Now here we have JDeveloper 11.1.2.3.0, and I've already created an application called Contact Demo. It's an ADF mobile application, and it has a feature file where I've pre-configured a feature called Find Contact of type AMX, a single AMX page called Find Contact in turn. If we have a look at that page, at the moment it doesn't have much in it, just a panel page with a header of an output text of a header, and you can see that on the right hand side. Now what I'm going to do is come down to the data control palette, and via the device features data control, I'm going to make use of one of the contact device features. And you might notice we've got create contact, find contacts, remove contact, and update contact. Now admittedly, most of those contact operations aren't that easy to use from the data control palette. As we'll later discover, they're much easier to work with programmatically, but you probably will use the find contacts method for searching all the contacts on the device that match a certain criteria. So I'm going to drag the find contacts method into the page, and one of the beauties of the data control palette in the JDeveloper IDE is it will wire up the whole page for me. So either it will give me a button to allow me to just go and search the contacts, but in this case not very useful because I haven't given the user the ability to enter any filter criteria, and that's where this other option, the ADF Mobile parameter form, comes in. And if I select that option, what it says is, hey, there's 3 parameters on the find contacts. You can see them down here. And what it's going to do is wire up the screen with a bunch of input text controls to allow the user to enter those values for me. So what the contact fields is a comma delimited list of all the different types of contact fields that the find contacts method will search on the user's behalf. So that can be things like name, birthday, given name, nickname, and so on. In addition, the filter field is the actual search criteria the user will enter to search all the different contacts, whereas the multiple parameter is a boolean of true or false, and if it's false, as soon as it finds the first contact that matches the criteria, it will return that contact, or alternatively true, it will return all contacts that match that. Now for the purposes of an application, it's probably not useful to give the user anything but the filter field, so I'm going to remove the other 2 fields and I'm going to hard code them on the user's behalf. But the end result here is, take filter, if we look at the page, you'll notice we now have an input text field called filter, and that's where the user will enter their search criteria to search the contacts, and then we have a command button that will actually kick off the find contacts method. You might notice the binding syntax here. What is that referring to? Well, if we go to the bindings page behind the scenes, the find context page def for this page has all the variables and all the operations that we're actually calling, and JDeveloper, or I should say ADF Mobile, will undertake and call on our behalf at runtime. Now I mentioned I wanted to hardcode some of those parameters, so it's from here that I would do it. And the find context operation, when I click the edit button, allows me to override some of those parameters. And you already can see that it's pre-populated some of these. It's basically saying that the user is going to search the name field only in the contacts. There are plenty of other options there, and we'll discuss that in the rest of the presentation, but we're just going to stick with name. The filter here actually maps back to the value of the input text control that the user is entering on the screen, so that's why that's pre-configured. And we talked about the multiple true-false value. Basically, shall the method return multiple contacts or just a single contact, the first one that it finds. So with the page with the filter and the find contacts button, all good and well that it will search for our contacts, but we necessarily want to see the results as well. So in the find context method of the data control, you can see that it returns a contact, and it returns a contact in all sorts of different fields for the contact. Now you might notice it says contact and not contacts. So a nuance of the data control method here is it doesn't return a collection, it only returns one contact. So even though we've got the multiple Boolean parameter to say return multiple of them, we'll only see the first contact that's actually returned. What we can do with that contact field is drag that in, drop it on this page, and we're going to pick out a ADF Mobile read-only form. And basically this is going to construct a page to show the first contact that's returned. It's going to show all their details as output text fields. Now I don't definitely want all those fields, so I'm going to delete some of them. Okay, and these are the only fields that will now show on the screen. Click OK, you can now see all the different fields applied to the screen and in actually the WYSIWYG editor as well. So with that in mind, let's actually run this in the iOS simulator and have a look at the results. Now via the magic of recording, that's already been deployed for me. So up pops the iOS simulator. Before we go to the application, let's just have a look at contacts, and we can see we've got somebody called John Appleseed in the contacts. So now if we go to our application, there's our contact demo. We open it up. We can see the filter field and the filter button, or find contacts button I should say. Weirdly, you can already see a record being returned. Why is that? Because in this case that operation has already been kicked off because we've dragged the results onto the screen. Now in a real application you would separate potentially the search fields and the find button from the actual results screen, but in this sort of contrived demo I've just whacked them all together. Regardless, let's now search for our friend Mr. Appleseed. So we type in Appleseed, done, click on Find Contacts, and now you can see the records for Mr. Appleseed returned. So now that we've looked at using the data control palette to make use of the contact device features on the ADF mobile application, what we're going to instead do is look at calling the contacts methods, that's create, update, delete and find, via a managed Java bean instead. And very much definitely we'll find we have much better control over accessing these specific APIs because they're a little clunky from the data control palette. So returning to JDeveloper Web 11.1230, in the features file I've created another feature called create contact, basically a single AMX page, this time called create contact by Java. That page you can see here, and at the moment doesn't include anything, but what I'd like to do is show you how to wire up a managed bean in order to create a bean, a class, that will call the Java API for creating a single contact. So to do this I'm just going to drop in a button, okay, and we'll change the textual label to create contact. And on the action listener property we're going to create a new bean called my bean, scoped at view scope, and it's going to have a method called contact. Now you'll notice that the action listener is now wired to that bean. You can see the bean behind in the application navigator, and if we go down to the ADFC mobile config file of this particular ADF mobile application, you'll be able to see the managed bean has been configured there. So with that in mind, rather than going through and entering lots of code on this in this demonstration, we'll actually look at some screenshots that actually describe the different codes or the different code that we call and the different APIs to create contacts, update contacts, remove contacts, and find contacts, all via the Java APIs. So the first example we're going to have a look at is making use of the Create Contact API. Now, the oracle.adf.model.datacontrols.device.deviceManager class provides a method called createContact, as you can see here. And basically, the createContact method within the Device Manager class takes one parameter, a contact object. And the contact object is essentially a number of different fields, all different information about the contact at hand that you want to create, such as their first name, their given name, nicknames, birthdays, notes, and so on. So you can call this method and pass in a contact, and it will essentially get added to the device's contact or address book. In addition, you will then get the contact object back, but you will not only get the contact object back, but some additional fields within the contact, such as the unique identifier of that contact within the device. So this UML diagram here shows you the contact class. It comes from the oracle.adf.model.datacontrols.devices package, and as you can see, it in turn is constructed of a number of other objects such as contact fields, contact names, and it has a number of getter and setter accessor methods for you to work with. With that example in mind, let's actually look at some real code examples to show you how you'd make use of this. So here we have the Create Contact API example from previous. We have the MyBean, ManageBean and the Contact Action Listener method that we constructed in the previous demonstration. And what we're actually doing in this method is we're grabbing the device manager via the device manager factory.getDeviceManager method. And on line 17, we're then going to call the Create Contact API that we saw previously. And as you can see on line 17, in the parameters, we're passing in a contact object, which essentially we're constructing on lines 6 to 15. And it's up to you to construct that object, populate the fields that you have at hand. You won't always have all the fields, but essentially you populate that contact object and you pass it to that method. That method will then create the contact on the device and return a new contact, which is essentially a pointer to the real contact in the contact or address book with an ID for that particular contact that you can refer to later on. So here we can see the Find Contacts API, or the method available via the Device Manager class. Now we've already actually seen this via the data control palette, so we have a reasonable idea what the parameters are used for here. The only additional comment to say is the contact fields parameter can take a number of different contact fields to search, and they just need to be comma delimited, such as ID, comma display name, comma name, comma nickname. So with those parameters in mind, let's actually have a look at Find Contacts API being used from a Java Managed Bean. So again, we can see our Contacts Action Listener and us grabbing the Device Manager. Then on lines 5 and 6, as you can see in line 6, we're calling Find Contacts, but the first two parameters are essentially empty strings. And what that does in this case is says, well, it's just a wildcard search. So because the third parameter, multiple equals false, well, even though it's a wildcard search, it will only return the first contact from the address book, and you'll get one contact back in that array, even though on the left-hand side we are expecting an array, it'll just have one element. On lines 7 and 8, it's kind of the opposite of that. We're still doing a wildcard search, but we're asking for all the contacts back. So on line 8, the Found Contacts 2 object will end up with an array with as many contacts that are in your address book. Lines 9 and 10 and 11 and 12 are just further permutations of what we've seen above, except to say that the star field is also a wildcard operator in this case, and then we will return one or multiple contacts based on the multiple field, the third parameter on the Find Contacts call. So these are all, I guess, simple examples of how to retrieve all the contacts, but maybe not something we're going to use too often. So how would we search for a specific contact is probably more useful. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to search contacts only searching the name, phone numbers, emails, and addresses fields. So questionably on the search fields, what values are actually allowed? And indeed, here's the complete set, ID, comma, display name, and so on and so forth. Just remember those must be comma delimited, so you can include them all, but just include them comma delimited. Any order doesn't matter. From there, in this example, we want to only search for Smith in the name, phone numbers, emails, and addresses field. Now, admittedly, Smith won't be in phone numbers. This is a little bit of a convoluted example, but you get the idea. And then finally, on line 16, what we're doing is calling the find contact method. We're going to search all those fields, name, phone numbers, emails, addresses for Smith. And because the third parameter is true, if we find Smith in more than one contact in those fields, we'll return an array of Smith contacts as such. The next example we want to talk about is the update contact API, and again available via the device manager class. We call the update contact method, and just like the create contact, we pass in a contact. Okay, now that contact is both the contact to search for and the contact that we're going to update. So that's a little weird, but what that means is you need to use the find contact method to find the specific contact that you're interested in. Then via that contact method, you update the contact object that you've got, you pass it into the update contact method as a parameter, and then you get the updated contact back. That sounds a little convoluted. Let's have a look at an example. So again, we've got the my bean here and the contact action listener where we've got the device manager object. So the first thing we're doing on line 6 is we're searching for Smith, okay, in this particular example, and we're searching the name fields. Now, the third parameter here is true, so we might retrieve a number of contacts back, an array of contacts where the name Smith is available. So in this kind of convoluted example, on lines 8, 9, and 10, contact 0 says, well, we're only going to work with the first contact that we actually find. And in this example on line 8, we're going to update the first phone number to 650-111-1234. Only for the first contact, we're going to update their first email address of type to work, and the first address of the first contact, setting the postal code to 94065. As a result, once we've updated that contact object that we retrieved on line 6, so we're only updating the first contact of the array. Then on line 12, we're calling the device update contact method, passing in that single contact. So in this case, it's the 0th element of the contacts array. And we get that back on the left-hand side of the expression as the contact object referred to as updated contact. The final API that we're interested in the device manager class is the remove contact method. And as you can see in this particular example, it takes a contact object, but it doesn't return anything. So what you literally need to do in this guy is go and use the find contact method or the create contact method to create a contact. And then once you've got a handle on a real contact, that's what you pass into this guy, and he will remove that associated contact from the address book. So as an example, again, we've got the contact action listener grabbing the device manager, and you can see on line 6 I'm attempting to find a contact, and I'm getting a number of contacts back where the contact name equals Smith. And then on line 8 I'm then calling remove contact, but I'm only removing the first contacts element in the array, so that's contacts 0 element. Whatever that contact is, we'll be removing that from the address book. Given we've now looked at the Java APIs for working with contacts, let's now look at the JavaScript APIs for working with the contacts from a local HTML page. Now before we actually dive into looking at an example, just a reminder that under the covers that the JavaScript APIs we're actually going to use here for working with contacts are in fact the PhoneGap or Cordova APIs. So the Apache Cordova documentation website, and here we have specifically version 1 because that's what ADF Mobile version 1 uses. The Cordova or PhoneGap documentation websites have excellent information on the actual APIs that you can make use of from the JavaScript side. So if you drill your way down here, you can see the contacts page and the create method, the find method, and so on and so forth. So you can find lots of useful information about those specific JavaScript APIs. So here with the create method, we can see that it takes a number of properties, and this would be essentially the same as calling the Java API. You're just going to do it from a JavaScript notation. So once again, returning to JDeveloper 11.1.2.3.0, you can see that in the features file I've created a new feature called Create Contact by JavaScript, but this time it isn't an AMX page, it's in fact a local HTML page called Create Contact by JavaScript.html. If we have a look at the page in turn, at the moment we can see it's a very raw HTML body, doesn't really contain much content, and what we'll do in the preceding slides is actually have a look at what we'd embed in order to call the JavaScript APIs to create, update, delete, and find relative contacts in the contacts list of the device. So what we have here is a HTML example of calling the Create Contact JavaScript API. What we can see on lines 3 to 6 is that we need to import the PhoneGap JavaScript library and the ADF EL JavaScript library. The function create contact here, which would be called from some button or some other construct in the main body of our HTML page, on line 9 creates a contact via the navigator.contacts.create method. In line 10, the contact object has a number of different properties which you can then assign to. So in this example, we've got contact.name is assigned to a new contact name of John Doe. On line 11, we then need to call the contact save method, and this will actually save that brand new contact into the contacts or the address book of the device. Now, thanks to the nuances of JavaScript, you can see that on success there's actually a function you need to define which will be called, and you can do whatever you need to do. Now, typically you wouldn't do anything on success, the program will just continue to run. But on failure, you can also define a function which you can then, if you want, display an error code or whatever else you need to do based on the create contact API call failing. In this example, we have the Find Contacts JavaScript API example, and on lines 3 to 6 we still import the PhoneGap and ADF EL JavaScript libraries, and then on line 8 we've created our own custom JavaScript function called Find Contact. Line 9, we set up the fields of the contact of the address book that we're going to search for or search through, so name, phone numbers, emails, addresses and notes. Notice that's an array, unlike the Java API where we actually passed in a comma delimited single string. Line 10 and 11, we then set up the actual filter data that we want to search the contacts address fields from line 9 from. And then finally on line 13, navigator contacts find actually does the act of doing the find where we're passing in the parameters previously. Now, if we do find a result, we call the onSuccess method or function, and if we don't find a result, we call the onFailure method. To continue to complete the JavaScript examples and to fill out all the examples, let's have a look at the update contact JavaScript call. Now, I haven't bothered in this example to include all the JavaScript library imports, it's just the same as previous, but as you can see in this particular example, what we first of all need to do on line 6 to 12 is actually go and find the contact that we want to update. Once we've done that, in the onFindSuccess function that we passed in on line 11, we can then do things like, well, if we found one contact and only one contact, we can then update that contact on line 16. So in this case, we're changing the nickname to Ace. And on line 17, we're then saving the changes. Okay, so we're really using two calls, one to the find contact, or I should say the find method of navigator contacts find, and then a separate call to contacts.save in the context of a single contacts. We're just basically updating that single record or array element and then calling the save method to persist the changes back to the address book. Finally, the last example is the remove contact JavaScript example, and just like the update example, first of all we need to go and find the record that we want to remove, and then via the onFindSuccess method, if we did find a contact, then we call contacts, in this case the first element, contact 0, and then remove it. Finally, let's just talk about some limitations with both the Android and iOS platforms when working with contacts. Now, where the limitations in working with these particular APIs are well documented is again in the Cordova documentation. And as you can see on this particular page, there happens to be some quirks for each platform on how it deals with the different contact data. Now, I won't go through all of these, but this is just again a reminder that you really should go and have a look at the PhoneGap or Cordova documentation to understand how you're going to have some strange little nuances between the devices that you'll need to cater for if you are allowing applications to be deployed to both platforms. So in summary, ADF Mobile under the covers uses the PhoneGap or Cordova APIs for doing all the works with, in this example, what we've been looking at today is all the contacts or the address book on your device. As we saw, there is a number of different mechanisms which we can access the contacts, that being the data control palette and the methods that are provided through it, the Java APIs or the JavaScript APIs, the first two being for AMX pages, the later being for HTML page. Obviously, the data control palette provides a productivity booster from the programming perspective because it wires up all the fields and the parameters of your screen. It creates the UI controls, creates the buttons, and does a lot of work for you. However, as we saw with the Java code and the JavaScript APIs here, you have a lot more programmatic control over what you're building, and in the case of contacts, it kind of makes more sense to use those APIs because essentially you're not normally wiring up screens to, for instance, create a contact. You'll probably be just creating or moving contacts between one address book and another. Just as a reminder, when you're developing ADF mobile applications, it's very important that you just don't test via the iOS simulator and the Android emulator, but that you actually test on the devices themselves. This is a common best practice for mobile development because the simulator and emulator are just that. They're not the real devices. You need to check that your application is going to work on the actual device itself.